I am sitting here in the studio with my good friend, Kevin Chemidlin. Kevin is the founder of Grow the Show, and when it comes to podcast growth, he's one of the most knowledgeable experts I know, which also means he's very well versed in what prevents people from growing their podcasts. And that's exactly what we're going to be breaking down here inside this episode, specifically the two biggest silent killers of podcast growth and what specific steps you can take to get your show in front of more listeners who need whatever it is that you have to offer. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Kevin, dude, I'm so excited you're here just to talk shop with you today. Thanks for making the time.
Court, I'm so pumped. Thank you so much for having me. Let's rock.
Of course. Well, something that you say, Kevin, which I always laugh at every time I hear you say this because I'm like, it is so true, is in podcasting land, if you build it, nothing will happen. And for the existing struggling podcasters listening right now, I'm sure they're like, ouch, yes, that's so true. And for the aspiring podcasters, maybe it's like, I don't know, they're hyperventilating a little bit. I'm curious, though, Kevin, to know, like, why do you think growing a podcast, first of all, it's harder to grow than any other platform? And coming into it, what do all podcasters need to understand so they can become the outliers that actually succeed in the podcasting space?
Yeah, so there's two things. I talk about them all the time. But I would say the thing that podcasters need to understand, audio podcasters specifically, is that, to your point, podcasting is the only content medium right now that has no algorithm. I always say, you are your own algorithm. Podcasting is totally decentralized. It's not all on one platform like Instagram is, or YouTube is, or TikTok is, or something like that. So we don't have this like algorithm, this piece of code that just takes content and shows it to people who might like it. It does not exist in podcast land. And so you're right. You could literally make the best, most incredible podcast episode that has ever been made. People laugh, people cry. It is just a perfect piece of audio content. And if you upload it online onto a podcast feed and do nothing else, literally no one will hear it. So if you're going to be a audio podcaster, you have to become your own algorithm. You have to find a strategy that works for you to get people who haven't heard of you to discover that you and your podcast exists. Although that's just step one. There's one other silent killer people need to understand, which is, okay, after they do tune into your show, is it good? Like, do your episodes make a promise? Do they deliver on that promise? If somebody tunes in, are they going to actually listen to the whole episode and get massive value? Or are they going to do what most listeners do when they come across a podcast that isn't outstanding? They turn it off immediately. So those are the two things that you have to keep in mind. Number one is that if you build it, nothing will happen. You're going to have a marketing strategy. And number two, listener retention, AKA, do people actually listen to your entire episode, is the number one silent metric that I look for with a podcast that's struggling.
I love that. And I do have questions for you around that. Marketing, consumption, how do we improve that? All of that. I'm curious on the algorithm front. Okay, I agree with you. I mean, podcasting is an open concept in the sense that nobody has ever owned podcasts. And yet now we have players on the scene like Spotify, who definitely have, I feel, an ulterior motive when it comes to like keeping listeners on their platform. Are there any considerations that we need to be making for platforms like that? I mean, YouTube is its own thing, but platforms that kind of sort of do have a little bit of, let's call it loosely, an algorithm where they're kind of showing more of your content to certain people versus somewhere like Apple Podcasts that really, it truly is just, you know, the podcasts are the podcasts and you have access to all the podcasts. What's your take on that?
Yeah. So what's funny is that Spotify is slowly becoming more like the YouTube outlier, right? Because you said, except for YouTube, right? Now, people are putting podcast episodes on YouTube. That's a whole different conversation. Is a podcast video, audio, blah, blah, blah. For those that are on YouTube, YouTube has an algorithm. Spotify is starting to make that happen. And I've even noticed this myself as a listener on Spotify, where I'm starting to discover podcasts there, where like they're adding short form video as a thing. And they're also, every once in a while I get, hey, you should check out this podcast. And you know, I'm a behind the scenes, behind the curtain guy. So every time that happens to me as a listener, as a podcast creator and coach, I'm like, whoa, this is interesting. This is an algorithm. And what's also interesting is Spotify's dashboard is starting to give us metrics around impressions, how many people saw your show versus how many clicked on it, how many tuned in. So as far as that's new to me, I'm pretty sure it's new to the podcast world. And so my take on that is Spotify is kind of just going from another Apple Podcasts where it is a phone book right? Where people aren't going to just look you up in the phone book and call you. They need to have a reason to call you. And that's how Apple Podcasts and the other listening apps are. Spotify is starting to transition into more of a YouTube-like presence where it does have an algorithm, and they're going to start showing shows to listeners who haven't heard from it before. I hope they do a great job at that, because that's going to make our lives as audio podcasters way easier, but we will see.
Yeah. It comes with some cons too, though, because we know on the algorithmic platforms, all the more reason why you got to have good completion rates, why you got to have good content, why you got to have all the things that naturally make a podcast good to begin with and keep people listening, because it is going to get more competitive in that sense, where now, okay, we are playing the algorithm game a little bit. I'll also be curious to see what Apple Podcast does about this, because one of my coaches said she had a client who she said, okay, this person messaged me and she wanted to join my program. And she's like, oh, okay, great. Let's have a call. How did you hear about me? The whole thing. And the girl who was sitting down on the call with my coach for her business, she said, I got a recommendation for your podcast on my phone. And so I started listening and I loved it. And now I'm here and I want to join your program. And so my coach was like, she's telling me this, on the podcasting side, because she was like, this is wild. Like, I've never had anyone say that before. They've been like, oh, someone told me about your podcast, or, oh, I found your podcast on YouTube or wherever. But that was very interesting. So I agree with you. It's going to be interesting to kind of see how that unfolds. Going back to something you said a moment ago, Kevin, about, okay, what most people do is they hit play and then they disappear, right? They stop listening. We see that dip happen in like the consumption rate. I know you talk about a healthy consumption rate is above 65%, that people are listening through 65% at least of your episodes. What are some of the key shifts that podcasters need to make to move the needle on this? Because let's look at someone like Joe Rogan. His episodes are like 3 hours long. What makes people listen to 3 hours of Joe Rogan that we can then apply to our shows to keep them listening? Let's say if like my episodes are 15 to 20 minutes. How can we increase that consumption rate?
So Joe Rogan tends to be the exception to all things, right? So like that's
so true.
That's one example where I'm like, it's just do the opposite of everything that he does, and your show will actually probably grow faster, because for a myriad of reasons. We can dive into that, but then there is one thing that I have seen disproportionately help podcasters improve their completion rates, and that is the intro. It is the first 90 seconds of an episode. What a lot of novice podcasters do is they meander. They kind of waste that time. They either, give an update on their life, or they're just like, hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. Let me tell you about the weather. Or if they have a guest, they'll start talking about the weather and like, hey, how did we meet? Oh, yeah, we were at a conference one time. It was really awesome. Or if they're a business owner, the first thing that they put at the beginning of their podcast episode is some sort of like commercial or call to action to their business. Be like, before we start, definitely get my free guide or whatever it is. Anything that is not, hey, welcome to the show. This is what the show is, and this is what you're going to get out of this episode. Anything except that is going to massively harm completion rates. Pat Flynn describes this thing that he calls the magic moment. Pat Flynn is an OG in the podcast space. If you're hearing my voice right now and you haven't heard of Pat, that means you're interested in podcasting, number one, and you're in for a treat. You should check out his stuff. He talks about the magic moment where a listener, when they first press play on your podcast episode, if they aren't already a fervent listener to your show, then they actually aren't putting their phone in their pocket yet to go do whatever it is that they do while they listen to podcasts, commute or exercise or whatever it is. They kind of hover for a minute and they're like, okay, I clicked play on this episode. This episode's 20, 30, maybe 60 plus minutes long. Is this really what I want to spend my time listening to for the next period of time? And until you, as the podcaster, hook them in and say, this is what this episode's going to do for you, this is why you should stick around. Until that moment happens, they're not sold and they're not giving you too much time. So if you never hook them in, what they do is they switch to a different podcast. They switch to Joe Rogan, right? Or they switch to some other podcast that they listen to. But the magic moment is when you successfully hook them and you make a promise that your episode is going to deliver upon. And that's where they go, this is what I want to listen to. And their phone goes away. And at that point, that's when you have room and you have space to talk about things. And unlike social media, where it's a bloodbath to take, 30-second videos and make them 20 seconds, with podcasting, we have so much more space and nuance to dive into things. That's the number one, when it comes to completion rate, that is the thing that I see the most that's killing shows, is that they don't do a great job with the intro. There's one other part though, that sometimes people do have good intros and they don't have good completion rates. And when it's that, it's just, this show isn't focused. The episode doesn't make a solid promise where it's like, this is what we were talking about today. And at some point in the episode, you lost them. Like you strayed away from that promise, or they just were like, I don't really know what we're doing here. And they turned the thing off. So that one's a little bit harder to diagnose because you really got to dig into like, well, what are we talking about here? But number one quick win thing to look at is episode intros.
Yeah. Oh, I love this so much, Kevin, because first of all, it's so true. Think of user behavior. Think of your own behavior when you listen to podcasts. Think of when you watch Instagram videos. Why do you think all the Instagram social media experts are telling you like, don't come onto your live and be like, hey guys, happy Friday. I hope you're doing well. You know, it's the same thing, even though we do have more space and we can take up more space and we can dive deeper than we can in a 7-second reel or TikTok. We also still need to follow the basic principles of both human psychology and marketing, which is what's in it for me. And if we're not communicating that early on, we've lost them. Something else that you talk about, which I know you talked about this when we were on that panel together at Podcast Movement, is the idea that a lot of people come at podcasting as what am I doing? How is this glorifying me, so to speak, when really we need to reframe that. Walk us through that reframe. What do we need to be thinking about instead so that we can do a better job at hooking our listeners and making our shows more listener focused?
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite exercise to help a podcaster that is not getting the growth that they want. And a lot of times they don't really know where I'm going with it at first. And so I'll say, okay, tell me about your podcast. What is your show? And they'll start talking about what they do on the podcast. They'll be like, I interview successful entrepreneurs. Or they might say, I share my expertise on whatever thing I'm an expert in. Or I tell stories about XYZ. And so I'll say, that's awesome, but I want to hear what your show is going to do for its listeners. You just told me what you are doing on your show. And I don't blame you for that because that's what you're most aware of because it's you, right? Like this is what I do. But if you want your podcast to grow, you have to get really good at talking about your show from the perspective of your listener. What is your show going to do for its listeners? And again, if your show is an interview show that interviews successful entrepreneurs, it's not they're going to get to hear stories of success. That's not what the show is doing for them. What a show like that is doing for their listeners is it might be you will hear these success stories and you will learn how they did it so you can do it too. Or it might be you will get inspired by their stories and you'll be able to see success in your own story. Whatever it is, when you put it in terms of the impact it will have on the listener, it becomes way easier to grow. And it becomes way easier to grow because you get better at talking about what your show is and instantly getting people to buy into it. I call it the eye test. When you describe your podcast to somebody in person and you say, oh, this is what my podcast is, do their eyes glaze over? And they're like, oh, that's cool. And then they change the subject? Or do their eyes light up and they're like, wow, that's really interesting. The secret to that is their eyes will light up when you make it about them. When it's like, this is what this show does for you. So my example, my podcast, Grow the Show, what I don't say is, I interview successful podcasters on how they grew their show, and I share my expertise after 5 years of coaching podcasts to grow. That's not what I say. I say, Grow the Show is the podcast that helps you grow your podcast. It's from your perspective.
Kevin, I love this. When you said the eye test, at first I thought you were going to say, if the word that comes out of your mouth first is, I do this, then like, that's a big red flag. But also, like you said, if their eyes glaze over, both of those, I think both of that works really well. You can steal that if you want.
It's the double eye test. Yeah, I'm totally stealing that. That's great.
Totally. The other thing too, that I want to dig into now with is the marketing piece of it. Okay. I think we'd be here all week if we were to, beat the dead horse of consistency. People know they need to be consistent with a podcast. Okay. We know consistent publishing is required because that's what builds trust. It's what builds the listener habit. It doesn't directly impact growth though. And personally, I think that's where people go wrong is they assume that, okay, as long as I can show up every week and get an episode out, well, my podcast is going to grow. You talk about how the other side of that equation is actually consistency in marketing. So at the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned becoming your own algorithm. What does that look like? What does consistent marketing actually look like for a podcaster, let's say, who maybe doesn't have a huge following or that doesn't have an ad budget, or that might be just starting this thing from scratch and they're trying to figure out, okay, how do I actually get in the groove of podcasting? And also, how do I market this thing so that people can find me?
It's about having a system for getting your show in front of other people. That's what marketing is. And the distinction that I make is podcasters, to your point, are very good at becoming consistent in publishing episodes because that's what we've been taught, right? It's just be consistent, your show will grow, be consistent and your show will grow. consistency is an ingredient. It's going to be very hard to grow a show that isn't consistent, but consistency alone isn't enough. The good news is that if you're a podcaster who has gotten really good at being consistent with publishing episodes, that means that you have the skill to become very good at getting people to find out about your show, because similarly, it's just about having a cadence. Just like you're like, every week I record an episode and I publish it. You want to do the same thing with your marketing strategy of choice. And in terms of the next question is usually, well, what marketing strategy should it be? And really, they all, and I'm curious your take on this, but what I'm seeing is all the podcast marketing strategies kind of boil to one of three things. Either number one, you collaborate a bunch with other podcasts. This is the one that I think can be the most efficient. There's pros and cons to all of them, but this is the one where 100% of the people that you reach listen to podcasts, right? Because you are collaborating with other podcasters. So we can talk about what that looks like. Number two is you take advantage of an algorithm elsewhere. So it could be a social media algorithm like Instagram or TikTok or X or LinkedIn. It could be a YouTube algorithm. It could be a search engine algorithm. Or number three is essentially one-on-one, where you are doing some sort of outbound, right? Where you are actually going out and you can do outbound email, you can do outbound social media, you can go out and tell people on the street, but you are actually one-on-one going out and saying, hey, here's a podcast that I have. I usually don't recommend the last one in most cases, but for some podcasters, that's the best way to get started. If, maybe you don't want to be a guest on other shows, or maybe you don't want to be on social media, you can go and tell other people about your show. In most cases, though, the strategies that I have seen drive disproportionate growth compared to effort, meaning like the shows that grew the most with the least amount of effort either got really good at collaborating with other podcasts, got really good at social media algorithms, or got really good at the YouTube algorithm.
Yeah. And I would say the first one being the one that often makes the most sense, or is maybe the most natural fit for people, because you've already got the setup, you're already familiar with podcasting, you're used to being behind a mic, sharing your expertise. The other one I would add to that, Kevin, you already know what I'm going to say, aren't you? It's SEO. SEO. Yes. We were talking about this at Podcast Movement. You're like, really? SEO? And I'm like, yes. One of the things though with SEO that I think a lot of people don't realize is that we haven't until now had a way to track how well it's working. And I don't know about you, but I don't know how many people are willing to like put an effort into something that we can't actually track and see like, how is this performing? Now we actually have tools that we can use to track the performance of keywords on your podcast, specifically in Apple and in Spotify. Wow. And this to me is really fascinating because SEO is a strategy. I'm all for leverage. I have very limited time to work every week. I have a 6-year-old that just like runs circles around me. And I'm like, how do you have so much energy? You can have half of your energy, So I have very compartmentalized time that I spend on my podcast. So I'm always looking to get the most out of that time. So with SEO, I always recommend it as like a foundational thing, and then layer in the methods that you're talking about. Pick one and layer that in, because SEO is one of those things that does have compounding effect and can compound with every episode that you release. And to me, if you can dominate a couple of keywords that that you've identified, like there's obviously legwork and research that has to go into this, but that you've identified that your listeners are searching for, you can dominate the competition in that keyword. And that helps you get found by more new cold listeners.
Yeah, I remember when we met at Podcast Movement and we were on the same panel and you started talking about this, I was like, oh, this is who I need to listen to, because SEO has never been a strong suit of mine. And so it's something that I've never paid that much attention to because I was able to achieve all the growth that I wanted through the other strategies. But I have heard other people along the way, like I've had in the past people like fight me in like email responses or whatever and be like, you're not mentioning SEO. And I'd just be like, look, yeah, it hasn't worked for me. If that works for you, great. So I was so excited to hear you talk about that at Podcast Movement. And I'm totally going to have you on Grow the Show to teach me even more. I have been getting into YouTube recently. So like taking my podcast, porting it over to YouTube, understanding what's different over there. And I've over there have seen how important and powerful SEO is. And I literally thought of you. I was like, okay, I'm seeing how powerful this is on YouTube. I can't wait to learn from Courtney how powerful this could be for my audio feed.
I think it's such an underdog strategy. And Kevin, like, look, people listening right now, right? Like if you're listening to this right now, you heard it here first. Like people are going to start talking about it because now we have ways to track it. Whereas with YouTube, we can see how that's working. But with podcasting, we haven't been able to see it until now. So for a lot of people, they were just like, I'm not going to even bother. But to your point, Kevin, I think the first one that you mentioned, the one about just collaborating and getting on other podcasts, let's dig into that, because I do feel like this is important for people to understand. I made the mistake of going out in the early days and being like, great, I've got my podcast. Now I'm going to guest on as many podcasts as I possibly can. And my show is naturally going to grow. And that's not what happened. And I don't think I earned a single client from it. And I don't even know if we got any new listeners from those efforts. I've learned later that I had everything totally backwards. I was doing it all wrong. I was making every mistake in the book as far as not finding the best shows to be on, shows with zero audiences. And I made a lot of mistakes that actually kept me from succeeding with that strategy. So if someone does want to go out and, let's say, use that strategy to grow their podcast, what do you recommend?
100%. And this is the strategy that is the bread and butter of what I do. Every client that I work with, we go through this process. This is the thing that I have be foundational for everybody that I work with. It's the podcast guesting strategy. And so it looks like this. There's a couple core pieces of getting the strategy right. The first piece is targeting the right shows. So finding shows for you to collaborate with. That's number one. Number two is the process of actually getting in touch with those shows and, building a relationship, getting them to say yes to having you on the show, which is another skill. And then the third one is, how do you show up as a guest and deliver value in the episode, and in the end, most importantly, get the people who are hearing you on that show to take the next step and go do something else to actually enter your audience. And so I'll just briefly touch on the three of those things. When it comes to targeting, most folks who I have seen try podcast guesting and kind of gave up on it express what you just expressed, which is, I did a bunch of them and I felt no results. Nothing happened. It was a complete waste of my time. And in most cases, when I come across that, the problem is they guested on shows that don't have any audience. Another challenge to audio podcasting is that it is not public how many listeners and downloads each show has. You can surmise it, and you can make a best guess based on reviews or Raphonic or Listen Notes or some of the tools that try to guess. But really, the truth is the only people who know how many downloads a podcast has are the people who have the login information to the hosting platform. That said, what I found is that the vast majority of shows do not have a listenership. And what most people do is they get a huge list of shows. They might, get an agency to find shows, or maybe they do the research themselves. They have this huge list. They send out 100 pitches and they immediately hear back from 30 other shows. And they're like, oh, great. Look at this. I'm going to be on 30 podcasts. Well, what I found is that the quicker a show responds and accepts you, the less audience it usually has. The shows that have significant audience, right, that have tons and tons of listeners, it's a little bit more competitive to get onto those shows. Now, that is not to say that it is not worthwhile to go on shows that have a smaller audience. Number one, it is great practice. Number two, it is incredible relationship building. Some of my best friends in life started from me being on their podcast. And at the time, they didn't have much listenership, or vice versa, right? So there's tons of benefits to this. And honestly, you don't want your first guest appearance to be on a show with 1 million listeners. Like you want to work your way up to that. But having said that, it can be exhausting doing 30 hours of podcast guest appearances and not seeing any results. So number one is, you want to try to strike a balance between smaller shows and bigger shows. Understand that bigger shows, it's going to be a longer tail approach. You're going to reach out to them. You might not hear from them at first. You might have to do a little engagement on social media, get in touch with the host. It might take a few months or sometimes even years for you to get featured on a really, really, really big show. But you just keep that in mind. Smaller shows happen quicker. They're not going to bring you as much audience. Bigger shows take longer, but they're going to be bigger swings. So you just keep that in mind with your mindset. As far as finding those shows, like the research to do, my recommendation is to try to reverse engineer the podcast guesting tours of other people that you admire. It could be guests that you've had on your show. It could be competitors in your space. It could be other podcasts that you listen to. What other shows have those podcasters collaborated with? We have this long paper trail online of people being on other podcasts. So you can just search and just see what other shows have the people that are like me been on. So that's how you find the shows. The secret to getting in touch with the shows, I'll just kind of give you the hack here. What everybody's doing is they find a huge list of shows and they just spam those shows with their pitch email. Hey, Kevin, I'm a huge fan of Grow the Show, grow and monetize your podcast. I've been listening for years. You should have my friend, this CEO billionaire who definitely has never listened to your show and is totally not a good fit for your show, on your podcast. Where should you send the booking link? And it's like these horrible, cringy pitches, and they're just terrible. So don't do that. What you want to hold back. You don't want to throw the whole pitch in your first email. My favorite way to do it is to find a show that you want to collaborate with, reach out either via email to that show or on social media, and just say, hey, what is the way that you prefer to receive guest pitches? Ask them how they want to be pitched. you will have a much higher response rate. So working with clients on this, when we make this adjustment, clients go from a 1% response rate, meaning 1 in 100 of their pitches get a response, to a 20 to 40% response rate, which is 20 to 40x, right? And it just starts the conversation. And then from there, usually they're like, okay, great, what's your pitch? And then the third part is being a great guest. What it comes down to, in my opinion, is showing up, adding value, but really the CTA at the end. So, where can people find you? My favorite thing, and the thing that counterintuitively has driven more podcast growth for me and my clients, is actually sending people to an email freebie instead of sending them to listen to a podcast episode. That was like a lot all at once. I kind of just like threw a bunch of the tips and tricks at you, but those are kind of the key things that I would want podcasters to understand.
Kevin, this was such a great crash course, though. If you're listening, literally, like, go skip back a few skips and listen to all that and take notes, get in a place where you can take some notes. Because Kevin, you just literally laid it all out. Here's what you need to do. And this is also why I'm excited to dig into the next episode with you and talk about the other side of this coin, growth and monetization, because we got to be able to have an audience so that we can monetize that audience. As we wrap this conversation up, Kevin, I'm curious, quick rapid fire here. If someone were to focus on one thing that they could do for growth for their podcast over the next 7 days, what would it be?
Oh boy. One thing over the next 7 days, it would be, find me 10 other podcasts that have similar audiences and reach out and get in touch with those people. And if you're afraid to pitch them, just note that you are in the same niche and ask them how they grew their audience. It's about reverse engineering, and see what they say.
Love it. So smart. Kevin, thanks so much for being here. This is awesome.
Pleasure's all mine. Thanks for having me.
And if you loved what you learned inside this episode, I would love it if you would scroll down, tap the 5 stars on Apple or on Spotify, and write a review or write a comment. Let me know what your biggest takeaway was. Then don't go anywhere, because in the next episode, Kevin is joining us back to break down why most podcasts struggle to make money and how to fix it, as well as the surprising role that your audience plays in your monetization strategy. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.